There is a lake in Canada so large that it would take you more than a week to walk its shoreline if you never stopped to sleep. A lake so deep that the bottom has never been fully mapped. A lake so cold that in some sections the water temperature has never risen above 4 degrees Celsius in all of recorded history. A lake so remote that fewer people have stood on its eastern shores than have reached the summit of Mount Everest. And for more than a century, certain parts of it, specific bays, specific stretches of coast, specific sections of the surrounding land, have been controlled, restricted, monitored, and kept from the public without a full or satisfying explanation. The lake is called Great Bear Lake. It sits above the 60th parallel in the Northwest Territories of Canada, in a landscape that most Canadians will never see in their lifetimes. It is the largest lake lying entirely within Canadian borders. It is the 8th largest lake on the surface of the earth. Its water is so clear that visibility can reach 30 meters in certain spots. And yet, despite all of that, despite the scale of it, despite the sheer physical presence of a body of water this enormous, it remains one of the least understood and least discussed geographic features in the country that contains it. People have lived around this lake for thousands of years. The Dean people, specifically the community now known as the Satuachna, the Bear Lake people, have called this place home for as long as oral history reaches back. And in their oral history, there is a specific instruction passed from elders to children across dozens of generations about the eastern shore. Do not go to that bay. Do not touch the yellow rock. Do not drink from that part of the shore. Do not eat the fish from that particular arm of the lake for long stretches of time. That place makes people sick. That warning is at least 1,000 years old. What the Dean knew and had encoded into their cultural memory across generations is something the rest of the world only discovered in 1930, when a prospector named Gilbert Labine paddled his canoe around the base of a cliff on the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake and found a vein of pitch blende and cobalt so rich it barely seemed real. Pitch blende, uraninite, the ore that contains uranium. Within months, the Canadian government had moved in. Within a year, a mine was operational. Within a decade, the ore from this remote lake at the top of the world had been shipped in secret to the United States, refined, and packed into the core of a weapon that would kill over 200,000 people in a single morning. The uranium in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came, in significant part, from Great Bear Lake, and the men who carried it out of the ground, who loaded it into burlap sacks and hauled it on their backs down to the transport route, did not know what they were carrying. They were not told. They were not protected. Their government and the government of their neighbor to the south knew exactly what was in those rocks and chose to say nothing. That was over 80 years ago. The mine eventually closed. The workers eventually got sick. The lake eventually got studied. And yet the restrictions around certain sections of the Great Bear Lake area have never fully lifted. Access to parts of the shoreline is still controlled. Environmental data from the region is still incomplete. And certain questions, the most basic and direct questions about what happened there, who knew what, who authorized which decisions, and what the water and the land and the people are still carrying, remain unanswered to this day. This is the story of that lake, and it is the story of what a government can hide in plain sight when a place is remote enough, when the people most affected have little enough political power, and when the secret is large enough that admitting it in full might change everything. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you want to keep going with stories like this one, stories that got buried, that got classified, that got quietly filed away in archives that nobody checks anymore, then subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, because this channel reaches people in places I genuinely would not expect, and I want to know. It helps more than you realize. Now, back to the lake. Great Bear. Lake is not a place most people can picture when they hear the name. It lacks the cultural visibility of Lake Superior or the global recognition of Lake Baikal. It does not appear on the maps that hang in elementary school classrooms. It does not feature in travel brochures or airline magazines, and that obscurity is in many ways the most important thing about it, because obscurity is what makes concealment possible. The lake covers 31,000 square kilometers. To put that in terms that are easier to hold in your mind, that is roughly the size of Belgium. It is larger than the state of Maryland. If you were to place the entire island of Ireland inside Great Bear Lake, it would fit comfortably with room along the edges. The shoreline stretches 2,619 kilometers, winding through bays and inlets and peninsulas in a shape that looks, from above, something like a hand with its fingers spread wide and reaching in different directions. 5 major arms extend from the central body of water, and each one has its own character, its own depth, its own weather patterns, its own particular history. The depth of the lake is 446 meters at its deepest measured point, though there are sections of the lake floor that remain incompletely surveyed even today. The water temperature at the surface barely reaches 15 degrees Celsius in August, which is the warmest month, and by October it is already dropping toward freezing again. The lake typically freezes over between December and January and does not fully thaw until June or July. During the freeze, the ice can reach 1.5 meters thick, and the sound it makes when it shifts and expands and contracts in the deep cold, that low, resonant, booming groan that carries for kilometers across the silent landscape, is one of the things that people who have spent real time in the region always describe when they try to explain what makes the place feel unlike anywhere else they have ever been. The surrounding landscape is a mixture of boreal forest and open tundra. Spruce trees that are 60 years old can be the height of a person, because the growing season is so short and the soil so thin and cold and nutrient poor that even the most resilient northern trees grow at a fraction of the rate they would manage farther south. In the western sections of the lake's drainage basin, there is forest, dark and dense and very quiet. In the north and east, the trees thin out and then stop entirely, and the land opens into a wind-swept flatness that has a beauty which is difficult to articulate because it is not a comfortable or welcoming beauty. It is the beauty of a place that does not require you, a place that was here long before you and will be here long after, and which makes no particular accommodation for the fact of your presence. Wildlife around the lake includes woodland caribou, barren ground caribou on the tundra to the north, wolverine, wolf, black bear, grizzly, and in the northern reaches, muskox. The fish are what matter most to the communities that live here. Lake trout, whitefish, inconu, cisco, Arctic grayling. These fish have been the nutritional center of the Dane way of life for thousands of years, and they remain central to daily life in Delaunay, the only permanent community on the lake's shores, a small town of approximately 500 people situated on the western arm. Delaunay is the Dene word meaning where the water flows, and it was known for most of the 20th century by the colonial name Fort Franklin, a name applied to honor the British naval officer John Franklin, who camped there in 1825. The original name has been restored, but the colonial history that the old name represents has not been so easily set aside. Reaching Delaunay requires a flight. There are no roads connecting the community to the rest of Canada's highway network. The Mackenzie Highway gets you to Tulita, about 170 kilometers to the south, and from there you take a small aircraft. In winter, a seasonal ice road, sometimes connects Delaunay to the highway system, but it is not always reliable, not always safe, and never guaranteed to be passable on any given day. The isolation is not metaphorical. It is geographic, structural, and in many ways deliberate. Communities like this one exist at the margins of Canadian infrastructure in a way that reflects something about how the state values different kinds of lives in different kinds of places. The eastern arm of the lake, the arm that reaches toward the ancient geological formations that made this entire story possible, is the most remote section of all. There are no communities on the eastern shore. There are no permanent fishing camps. There is a stretch of coast that is difficult to navigate by boat because of the wind patterns that tend to funnel through that particular arm, and the coast itself is rocky and exposed and offers little shelter. It is, by most practical measures, the least visited portion of an already extremely remote lake, and it is precisely there, in a bay called Cameron Bay, in a place that would come to be called Port Radium, that everything begins, long before anyone outside of the Northwest Territories had ever heard of uranium, long before the concept of radioactivity had been formally articulated by Marie Curie in her Paris laboratory, long before the Manhattan Project, or the Cold War, or the concept of nuclear weapons had entered the human imagination at all. The people who lived on and around Great Bear Lake knew that something about the eastern shore was different. Not different in a way that was beautiful or interesting, different in a way that was dangerous. The Satu'utune had specific cultural protocols around certain areas of the lake. These protocols were not written down in the way Western institutional cultures write things down, filed in folders, stored in archives, typed into reports. They were carried in stories. They were embedded in the instructions that elders gave to young hunters and fishermen heading out onto the water. They were encoded in the rules that governed which areas were safe to camp in, which fish from which parts of the lake should not be eaten in large quantities over long stretches of time, and which sections of the eastern shore should be treated with particular caution. They were knowledge systems, and like all knowledge systems that survive for centuries, they encoded information that had been gathered through experience, through observation, and through the painful lessons that come from generations of people learning what happens when the rules are not followed. The Eastern Bay, the specific inlet that would eventually be called Port Radium by the people who arrived to mine it, was a place the Dean avoided. Not entirely, and not always, because the broader eastern arm of the lake was still used and traveled. But for certain activities, in certain seasons, the specific bay and the cliffs surrounding it were treated with a kind of respectful distance. The Dene name for the area translates roughly as the place of the poison rock. Different Dene language scholars and community members have rendered the translation slightly differently across different accounts, but the core word that keeps appearing is poison. Not a strange mineral, not an unusual rock formation. Poison. Do not drink the water from that particular shore. Do not eat the fish caught in the bay near the seeping cliff face in large amounts over long periods. Do not camp on the rocks close to the yellow staining. Do not handle the colored ore that bleeds from the cliff. The yellow rock they were describing was uranium ore. The yellow staining on the cliff face was oxidized uranium compounds leaching out of the pitch blende deposit that had been sitting there for millions of years. The risk from fish in that immediate bay existed because uranium and its radioactive decay products, radium and radon among them, had been slowly leaching into the water and sediment from that geological formation for geological timescales, creating a natural concentration of radioactive material in the local food chain. The Dene did not have the word uranium. They did not have the scientific framework of radioactivity, isotopes, half-lives, or ionizing radiation. What they had was something arguably more reliable for a community in a specific place over a long period of time, which is centuries of observed cause and effect. People who spent extended time in that particular bay tended to have worse health outcomes than people who stayed away from it. The rock had qualities that were unlike other rocks in the region, and over time, the community had encoded that information into practice. Stay away from there. Be careful there. That place gives poison. That information saved lives. It was a functional, accurate, and genuinely sophisticated response to a real environmental hazard, arrived at through methods that predate the scientific method by a very long time, but that accomplish something the scientific method is designed to accomplish, which is the reliable identification of cause and effect in the natural world. The Dene did not need a Geiger counter to know that something at that bay was making people sick. They watched. They remembered. They taught. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is central to everything that comes after it. When the Canadian government and El Dorado gold mines arrived in the 1930s, they brought with them the standard assumption of their era, that the indigenous people of the region had nothing scientifically useful to contribute to an understanding of what was in the ground or in the water. The Dean's knowledge about the eastern shore was not formally consulted. Their warnings were not recorded as data. They were not analyzed. They were not taken seriously in any institutional sense. The geologists who came to assess the deposit understood what they were looking at from a mineralogical standpoint, and they proceeded accordingly with confidence and speed on the assumption that they were the ones who actually knew things. What the Dene knew was set aside. This was not unusual for the era. It was the standard operating posture of Canadian resource extraction and colonial administration throughout the first half of the 20th century and well beyond it. Indigenous ecological knowledge was categorized as folklore, as superstition, as the pre-scientific observations of people who had not yet been integrated into the modern world and its ways of knowing. It was dismissed, and the dismissal had consequences that cascaded outward for decades, affecting not just the Dene community at Great Bear Lake, but the credibility of the entire institutional framework that was supposed to be protecting people. There is a statement made by Paul Botten, an elder from Delaunay, who has spoken in various contexts about what the community was told when the mine was active. He described being told that the work was safe. He described the way workers were not given any particular instructions about handling the ore bags or washing themselves after contact with the material. He described the community's confusion when people started getting sick, and the silence from the government and the company when families began asking what was happening. And he described the way the elders of the time had shaken their heads because they had known. The instructions about that shore had been there all along, for longer than anyone could remember, and nobody with the power to act had listened. The instructions were right. The Dean had been right. And by the time anyone in a position of institutional authority was willing to acknowledge that fact, even partially, the damage had already been done. The recorded European history of Great Bear Lake begins in the early 19th century, with the expeditions of British and Canadian explorers moving through the Mackenzie River Basin. The Hudson's Bay Company had established trading relationships with Dean communities throughout the Northwest. By the late 1700s and by the 1820s, the lake had been reached and roughly charted by European-trained explorers. John Franklin, the British naval officer who would die famously in the Arctic in 1847 while searching for the Northwest Passage, camped at the western shore of Great Bear Lake in 1825 during his second overland expedition across northern Canada. He was among the first Europeans to describe the lake in any systematic way for a European audience. He noted its size, its clarity, its fish, and the Dean guides who kept him fed and alive in an environment his own training had not prepared him for. He named the Western Bay after himself, which tells you everything you need to know about how these expeditions understood their relationship to the places they passed through. The place already had a name, multiple names in multiple Dane dialects. Franklin applied his own name over top of them anyway, and for over 100 years the community now called Delinay appeared on every official Canadian map as Fort Franklin. The Hudson's Bay Company post on the western shore served as a trading hub throughout the 19th century. Fur was the economy. Beaver, fox, lynx, marten, muskrat. The Dean exchanged furs for goods at prices that reflected the power imbalance built into the system, and the trade was constant, and it tied the community into the broader economic machinery of colonial Canada in a way that was very difficult to exit from once it was established. Various explorers, surveyors, and company employees passed through or near the eastern sections of the lake across the 19th century. Some of them noted the unusual geology of the eastern arm. The coloring in the exposed rock formations was strange. There were orange and yellow stains on the cliff faces that did not match the typical appearance of Canadian shield rock. Some of the ore samples were unusually heavy. A few of the more observant surveyors and geologists made note of this in their journals and reports, flagged it as potentially interesting, and moved on to the next item on their survey agenda. In 1900, when the Northwest Territories were being formally reorganized under federal administration as part of the larger project of consolidating Canadian authority over its northern lands, the government began systematic mineral surveys across the region. These surveys were designed to catalog what was under the ground and to assess the economic potential of territory that was vast and poorly understood. Gold had driven the Klondike Rush in 1897, and Ottawa was acutely aware that the northern territories might contain mineral wealth that had not yet been properly inventoried. Survey teams spread out across the Mackenzie district, and their reports accumulated in Ottawa over the following years. The eastern shore of Great Bear Lake appeared in at least one geological survey report from the first decade of the 20th century as geologically interesting, with specific notation of what the surveyor described as potentially significant radium-bearing mineral formations. Radium, in the early 1900s, was an element of intense scientific and commercial interest. The work of Marie Curie and her husband Pierre had given it an aura of the modern and the miraculous. Radium spas operated in Europe. Radium water was sold as a health tonic. Radium paint illuminated watch dials and instrument panels. The element was new, strange, luminous, and presumed by much of the popular culture of the era to be beneficial. The ore that contained radium was pitchblende, also known as uraninite, and it also contained uranium, which at that point in history was considered a secondary and somewhat inconvenient byproduct of the more commercially important radium extraction process. The survey reports that flagged the eastern Great Bear Lake formations were not immediately acted upon. The region was simply too remote for extraction to be economically viable with the infrastructure that existed at the time. Getting material out of that location would require a supply chain across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness, a workforce willing to operate in those conditions, and some mechanism for transporting extracted ore to a processing facility that did not yet exist anywhere close to the lake. The knowledge went into the files. The files went into the archives. The years passed, but the information was there. The eastern shore of Great Bear Lake had been identified as a site of radium-bearing mineralogy at least 2 decades before Gilbert. Labine's discovery in 1930 would be celebrated in the official historical account as the moment everything began. The decision about when to act on that knowledge. and how, and with what protections for whom belonged to the government. And the government would make those decisions in a particular sequence for particular reasons that deserve a careful look. Gilbert Labine was not a university-trained geologist. He did not come from the academic or governmental scientific establishments that produced most of Canada's early mineral surveyors. He was a prospector born in Westmeath, Ontario, in 1890, who had spent his working life moving through the mineral-rich Canadian Shield on instinct and experience, and a specific kind of geological intuition that formal training sometimes cultivates and sometimes suppresses. He had been involved in mining operations in northern Ontario during the silver rush around cobalt, and by the late 1920s, he was actively looking for the next significant find, which is the perpetual occupation of the serious prospector. In the spring of 1930, Labine and his partner Charles St. Paul flew into the Great Bear Lake area. Labine had been reading the old survey reports. He had seen the references to the eastern shore. He knew what he was looking for, at least roughly, and he knew that the geological indicators were there if anyone was willing to make the trip to look at them properly. The bush plane that carried them in landed on the lake, and they made their way by canoe around the eastern shoreline. On May 16, 1930, on the cliff face above Cameron Bay, on the eastern arm of the lake, Gilbert Labine found what he had come looking for. The exposed rock face showed cobalt bloom, those bright pink and silver mineral stains that indicate the presence of cobalt nickel ores in the rock below. And behind the cobalt bloom, running in veins through the cliff face, was pitchblende. Black, heavy, dense, unmistakable pitchblende, and not just a thin seam of it. Labine reportedly stood in front of the cliff for a long time without saying anything. What he was looking at was the largest known deposit of pitchblende, and therefore of radium, in the Western Hemisphere. He staked his claims immediately. He and St. Paul worked quickly, hammering stakes into the ground across the relevant sections of the bay, establishing the legal foundation for extraction before anyone else could get there. Then they flew out, and Labine went to Ottawa. What happened next is instructive because of the speed of it. Labine's discovery became public in late 1930, and the government's interest was immediate and intense in a way that went beyond the ordinary processing of a new mineral claim. The Federal Department of Mines issued statements. The National Research Council was briefed. Communication with British scientific counterparts in the United Kingdom was initiated. Within months of the discovery being announced, there were discussions happening at levels of government well above the normal administrative channels for managing a new mining operation in the Northwest Territories. The reason for this was that the world had changed since the early 1900s, when those first survey reports had flagged the eastern Great Bear Lake formations and then been filed away. By 1930, the nature of uranium was better understood. The scientific work of the 1920s had given physicists a clearer picture of atomic structure and theoretical speculation about what might be possible if the nucleus of a uranium atom could be manipulated, split, made to release its energy in a controlled, or, more to the point, an uncontrolled way was already circulating in the international physics community. The discovery of a massive pitchblende deposit in the remote Canadian North was not just a commercial opportunity, it was a strategic one. Labine formed Eldorado Gold Mines Limited, which would later become Eldorado Mining and Refining Limited, and ultimately, under government ownership, Eldorado Nuclear Limited. The name changes are worth noticing because they track the progression of understanding about what the material was actually for. Gold, then mining, then nuclear. The language moved with the technology. Construction of the mine at what would be called Port Radium began in 1932. The infrastructure required to make the operation work was substantial: a bunkhouse, processing facilities, a dock, a radio station, a fuel depot. All of this material had to be transported into the lake, a logistical challenge that required multiple transfer points across the Mackenzie River system. Getting supplies in and getting ore out required a chain of transportation that would eventually involve small aircraft, river barges, truck routes, and rail connections, stretching from the mine face all the way to the refinery in Port Hope, Ontario. The ore that came out of the Port Radium mine was processed first to extract radium, which was refined at Port Hope and sold commercially. But uranium was also coming out of the ground, and as the 1930s progressed and the physics of nuclear fission moved from theoretical to experimentally verified, the uranium that had initially been considered a waste byproduct of the radium extraction process was quietly reclassified as something far more important. The government began acquiring a tighter and tighter hold on the El Dorado operation. By 1944, the federal government had nationalized El Dorado entirely, purchasing all outstanding shares and bringing the company under Crown Corporation status. This was done under wartime emergency powers with minimal public explanation. The official justification was national security. The real reason was that by 1944, the Canadian government was deeply involved in the Allied nuclear weapons program, and the ore coming out of Port Radium was one of the most important material inputs into that program. That involvement was something the people living closest to the mine, the Den community at what is now Delaunay, were told absolutely nothing about. The workforce that made the Port Radium operation function was not exclusively Dean, but the Dean filled a specific and essential role in the logistics of the operation. The mine itself was worked primarily by non-Indigenous miners brought in from the south, rotating in and out on schedules that allowed them to avoid year-round exposure. But the transportation of ore from the mine to the first leg of the shipping route required the labor of the local community, and that labor was provided by Dean men who were hired for the portage work. The portage route from the mine to the lake transport involved loading the uranium ore into canvas or burlap sacks and carrying those sacks on their backs across the portage section of the route. The ore bags were heavy. The work was physical and demanding. The portage itself covered a stretch of terrain that the men walked across multiple times per season, carrying their loads. The men were not told what was in the bags. They were not told that the material was radioactive. They were not given dosimetry badges to measure their radiation exposure. They were not given protective clothing beyond whatever they would ordinarily wear for a day of manual labor in the subarctic. In fact, there are consistent accounts from community members and oral histories collected in Delaunay that describe the ore bags being used as pillows or mattresses during overnight stops on the portage route. The men would sleep on the very material that they were carrying, not because they were reckless, but because they had no reason to know that sleeping on it was dangerous. Nobody had told them, this is worth being very direct about, the health risks of prolonged exposure to uranium ore and its decay products, particularly radon gas and radium, were not unknown in 1932 or 1942. The deaths of radium, dial painters, the women who painted luminous watch dials in New Jersey and Illinois with radium-laced paint and who were instructed to point their brushes with their lips, had been documented and litigated as early as the mid-1920s. The occupational health hazards associated with uranium and radium mining were understood in the scientific and industrial communities. Proper handling procedures, the use of respirators, dosimetry monitoring, the importance of not ingesting or inhaling radioactive dust were all known practices that were being implemented in various contexts in Europe and the United States. They were not implemented at Port Radium for the Dean portage workers. The record on this is consistent across multiple independent sources: the community members who worked the portage, the community members who observed the work, and the researchers who later investigated the episode all describe the same absence of protection. The men who carried the ore were not protected because protecting them was not a priority. The ore needed to move. The men were available to move it. The details of their long-term health were not a consideration that factored into the operational planning of the mine. The men who did this work were paid. The wages were not generous by any measure, but they represented real income for a community whose participation in the cash economy was limited and whose alternatives for earning money were constrained by geography and by the broader economic structures of colonialism in the North. The DNA men who did the portage work were not coerced in the simplest sense of that word. They chose to take the work because taking the work made sense given the options available to them. But they made that choice without the information they would have needed to make it truly freely, which is not a free choice in any meaningful sense. You cannot meaningfully consent to a risk you do not know exists. The irony that runs through this particular chapter of the story is worth naming explicitly. The people who had known for generations that there was something wrong with that eastern shore, who had encoded that knowledge into their cultural practice and passed it forward specifically so that future generations would be protected from exactly this kind of harm, were the same people who were hired to carry the source of that harm on their backs. Without protection, without information, without any acknowledgement of what they already knew, the knowledge that should have protected them was ignored by the people who made the operational decisions, and then those same decision makers turned around and hired the knowledge holders to do the most dangerous work. That is not an accident. It is the logic of extractive colonialism applied to a lake in the Northwest Territories of Canada during a world war, with consequences that are still being lived. To understand why the Canadian government moved so quickly, so completely, and with so little public explanation when it nationalized the El Dorado mine in 1944, you need to go back to 1939 and to a discovery that changed the calculation of everything. In December 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved nuclear fission of uranium for the first time in a controlled laboratory experiment. The news reached the broader physics community within weeks, and its implications were immediately and almost universally understood. If a uranium nucleus could be split by a neutron, releasing energy and more neutrons, which then split more nuclei, releasing more energy and more neutrons, in a chain reaction, then the energy released by a mass of uranium undergoing sustained fission would be enormous. The question of whether that energy could be captured, directed, or weaponized was not a theoretical question. It was an engineering question. And in 1939, as the Second World War began, the governments of the major powers understood very clearly what a successful answer to that engineering question would mean. Britain launched its nuclear weapons research program in 1940 under the code name Tube Alloys. The United States launched what would become the Manhattan Project in 1942 under Brigadier General Leslie Groves. Canada was a partner in both programs, and the Canadian contribution was not peripheral. Canadian scientists worked at the Montreal Laboratory, a joint British-Canadian-French project established in 1942, which contributed directly to the theoretical and experimental work that made the eventual bomb designs possible. And Canada had something that neither Britain nor the United States had in comparable abundance, which was uranium. The ore from Port Radium, refined at the facility in Port Hope, Ontario, that had been built to process radium from the El Dorado ore, was redirected toward uranium production as the nuclear weapons program scaled up. The refinery at Port Hope became a critical node in the Allied nuclear supply chain, producing uranium compounds, specifically uranium trioxide, and uranium hexafluoride in various forms that were shipped to American facilities for further processing and ultimately for use in the weapons being designed at Los Alamos. The scale of this operation was substantial. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of tons of uranium ore moved through the chain that ran from the cliff face at Cameron Bay on Great Bear Lake through the Dean Portage route onto the Mackenzie River barge system across a series of transfer points, by rail to Port Hope, through the refinery, and then by secure shipment to American weapons facilities. The exact tonnage figures have been a matter of historical research and some dispute over the years, with different estimates based on different archival sources, but the directional fact is not in dispute. Port Radium was a primary uranium source for the Allied nuclear weapons effort. On July 16, 1945, at a test site called Trinity in the New Mexico desert, the world's first nuclear weapon was detonated. The material in that device included uranium processed from ore that had come through the Port Hope facility, which meant it had come from the ground at Great Bear Lake, which meant it had passed through the hands of Dean men who had been told they were doing routine mining, transport work, and who had slept on the ore bags on cold northern nights and had breathed the dust and had gone home to their families carrying trace amounts of the material on their clothes and skin. On August 6, 1945, the Little Boy bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On August 9th, the Fat Man bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The combined death toll in the immediate aftermath was somewhere between 129,000 and 26,000 people, with estimates varying based on methodology and the time frame used to assess radiation-related deaths. The uranium in those weapons came, in part, from the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake. The community at what is now Deline was never told any of this. The men who had done the portage work, the families who had lived adjacent to the mine operation, the elders who had watched the operation expand through the 1930s and 1940s, none of them were informed about the nature of what they had been handling, about the purpose for which it had been extracted, or about the connection between their remote northern lake and the most destructive military technology in human history. They were not told during the war, because wartime secrecy was the justification for silence. They were not told after the war, because the information remained classified, and because telling them would have required an acknowledgement that they had been exposed to radiological risk without their knowledge or consent. The mine continued operating after the end of World War II. The Cold War had begun almost immediately, and uranium was now the most strategically important mineral on Earth. The logic of the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union meant that uranium supply was a national security priority, and Port Radium continued to produce. The community continued to be adjacent to the operation. The portage work continued. The ore kept moving. The mine did not close until 1960, when falling uranium prices and the development of higher yield sources elsewhere made the remote and logistically complex Great Bear Lake operation less competitive. The infrastructure was abandoned. The workers were gone. The bunkhouses and processing equipment and fuel tanks and dock structures were left in place, weathering in the northern climate, leaching into the soil, draining toward the lake. And the community of what is then still called Fort Franklin, sitting on the western arm of the same lake, began to notice that people were getting sick. The pattern of illness that emerged in the community at Deline across the 1960s and 1970s was not a secret within the community itself. People talked. Elders noticed. Women who kept track of the health of their families and their neighbors noticed that certain men were getting sick, with particular kinds of illness at what seemed like too high a rate: cancer, lung disease, kidney problems, the kinds of illness that communities with no medical establishment and no access to epidemiological data cannot easily quantify or document, but that the people living through them can recognize as a pattern. The men who had done the portage work were getting sick. Their close family members were getting sick. The community that had lived through the active years of the mine and been most proximate to the ore handling and transport operations was showing health patterns that did not match what the community expected for its own members. And when community members asked questions, when they went to the territorial health authorities, when they tried to get information about whether the work that their fathers and grandfathers had done at the mine could have contributed to what was happening to the community's health, the answers they received were non-answers. There was no established connection. The illnesses were being monitored. The situation was being assessed. The relevant authorities were looking into it. The community members who were sick kept dying. This period, the 2 decades after the mine's closure, during which the community was asking questions and not receiving answers, represents one of the clearest documented examples of institutional stonewalling on a public health issue in Canadian history. The government of Canada knew what had been in that ore. The government knew that the men who had worked the portage had not been protected. The government had the health data that would have allowed for a preliminary assessment of whether elevated risk existed for the community. And the government chose, consistently, year after year, to not share that information clearly, not commission the epidemiological study that the community was asking for, and not acknowledge the possibility that what had happened at Port Radium had hurt the people who lived closest to it. There is a phrase that kept appearing in government correspondence and internal memos from this period when researchers eventually obtained those documents through access to information requests decades later. The phrase was that the matter was under review. The matter was always under review. The review never seemed to reach a conclusion that required the government to do anything in particular. In the community, the illness went on. The question of cancer rates in Delaunay is one of the most contested and carefully documented aspects of this story, and it is worth spending real time on it because the way that question has been handled by the government, by researchers, and by the community itself over the past 50 years tells you more about how power operates in these situations than almost anything else in the record. The community of Delaunay has a population that has fluctuated over the decades, but has generally been in the range of 400 to 600 people. A community that's small presents a genuine methodological challenge for conventional epidemiology. When you are looking for elevated rates of a specific disease in a population of 500 people, the numbers involved are small enough that statistical analysis becomes complicated. A difference of 3 or 4 cases of lung cancer in a community. That size, compared to a baseline expectation, might represent a dramatic proportional increase, but the absolute numbers are small enough that a government or a research institution that wants to dismiss the finding can always argue that the sample size is insufficient to draw reliable conclusions. This is exactly what happened. Community members and the local leadership in Delaunay began formally pressing for a proper epidemiological study in the late 1970s and through the 1980s. They had counted their own dead. They knew how many men who had worked the portage had died of cancer, how many of their immediate family members had become ill, how many people who had lived adjacent to the mine, operation, or the transportation route were showing elevated rates of illness. They had done their own counting with no resources and no institutional support, because nobody with resources and institutional support was doing it for them. The federal government eventually commissioned a health study. The first formal study of cancer incidence in Delaunay was released in the 1990s, and its conclusions were characteristically cautious. The study found that certain cancer types, appeared at elevated rates compared to expected rates for the Northwest Territories population as a whole. Kidney cancer, lung cancer. The elevated rates were statistically suggestive, but the study concluded not statistically conclusive given the small population size. More study was needed. The situation was being monitored. A full assessment would require additional data collection. The community was not satisfied with this, and their dissatisfaction was reasonable. More study had been needed for 30 years by that point. The monitoring had produced a series of non-answers, and meanwhile the men who had worked the portage were mostly dead, and their children were middle-aged, and the community had been waiting for someone to acknowledge what they already knew. What the community knew, and what eventually became clear to anyone who looked carefully at the available evidence, was that the men of Deliné, who had done the portage work during the active years of the Port Radium mine, had been exposed to radiological hazards that significantly exceeded what any occupational health standard of the era would have considered acceptable. Their exposure had not been measured, tracked, or recorded, so there was no direct dosimetry data. But the physical conditions of the work, the handling of uranium ore in burlap sacks without respiratory protection, sleeping in proximity to the ore, working on the portage route for multiple seasons, constituted a pattern of exposure that researchers in subsequent years assessed as likely to have resulted in significant cumulative dose for the workers involved. The lung cancer connection is particularly direct, and it is worth explaining why. Uranium ore contains uranium and its decay products, a chain of radioactive elements that includes radium, radon, lead-210, polonium-210, and others. When uranium ore is disturbed, crushed, or moved, it releases radon gas. Radon is an inert gas, which means it does not bind to anything chemically, but it is highly radioactive, and when inhaled it deposits its decay products, including polonium-210, directly into lung tissue. Those decay products emit alpha radiation, which is not very penetrating but is intensely ionizing at short range, and at short range includes the cells of the bronchial and alveolar tissue that the polonium-210 has deposited in. Long-term inhalation of radon and its decay products is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the general population after smoking. For someone working directly with uranium ore in an enclosed or semi-enclosed space without respiratory protection, the exposure could be orders of magnitude above the general population baseline. The men of Deliné who worked the portage had been inhaling radon from disturbed ore in burlap sacks for years, without any protection and without any knowledge of what they were inhaling. The lung cancer cases that appeared in the community in the decades following the mine's operation were not a mystery to anyone who understood the physics of radon exposure and the conditions of the portage work. They were a predictable consequence of a situation that the government had created and then chosen not to warn anyone about. By the 1990s, the community had developed its own name for what had happened to them. They called themselves the Village of Widows, not because the men had all died, but because so many of the men who had worked during the mine years, the men who had been the husbands and fathers and brothers of the community, were gone. The women who remained had watched their men die at rates and ages that were not what a healthy community produces. That was the lived reality that the epidemiological studies, with their caveats about sample size and statistical significance, were trying to quantify. The community had already done the quantification. They had done it the same way the dean had always done it, through careful observation and communal memory. And their count did not produce a reassuring result. The environmental contamination at and around the Port Radium mine site is a parallel chapter in this story, and it runs alongside the human health question with its own set of contested findings, delayed studies, and carefully worded government assessments. When the mine closed in 1960, nothing was done about the site for a long time. The infrastructure that had accumulated over 30 years of operation, the tailings piles, the chemical processing residues, the fuel tanks, the structural materials, remained in place and continued to interact with the northern environment through the processes that northern environments apply to everything left within them. Freeze and thaw cycles, rain, snow, and the simple passage of time. Uranium tailings, the crushed rock left over after ore processing, contain elevated concentrations of radium and other uranium decay products. When tailings are left exposed to weather and water, those decay products leach into the surrounding soil and into any water body nearby. The eastern arm of Great Bear Lake is one of the largest and most ecologically significant freshwater bodies in North America. The mine tailings were sitting next to it, and had been for decades before anyone did a systematic study of what was going into the water. The first formal environmental assessment of the Port Radium site was not conducted until the late 1980s and early 1990s. The findings of those assessments were, in the careful language of environmental science, concerning. Elevated concentrations of radium-226 were found in the sediment of Cameron Bay adjacent to the mine site. Arsenic levels in the bay sediment were elevated. Uranium concentrations in the water were measurable and above baseline levels for the surrounding lake. The contamination was real, was documented, and was directly attributable to the mine operation. The government's response to these findings was remediation. Between 1996 and 2005, a federally funded cleanup project operated at the Port Radium site, removing the most severely contaminated materials, capping tailings, treating residues, and attempting to reduce the ongoing leaching of contamination into the lake. The project was described by the government at its conclusion as largely successful, with the site having been remediated to a standard that allowed for long-term monitored care rather than active ongoing intervention. What the remediation did not do, and what is important to understand, is that it did not return the site to its pre-mining condition. Contamination that had leached into the lake sediment over decades could not be removed by a 5-year cleanup project. The radium-226 that had settled into the floor of Cameron Bay was still there after remediation and will remain there for thousands of years because radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. Cleanup in this context does not mean clean. It means contained to a level that regulatory frameworks define as acceptable for long-term management. The community at Deliné was not entirely satisfied with either the scope of the remediation or the characterization of its results. A persistent concern has been that the cleanup addressed the most visible and acute sources of contamination, but did not fully resolve the questions about what the lake itself, specifically the eastern arm and Cameron Bay, carries in its sediment and in the organisms that live in and around that sediment. The Fish Advisory for the Cameron Bay area, the guidance about limiting consumption of fish from that specific part of the lake, remained in effect after the remediation. That advisory exists for a reason, and the reason is that the contamination in the sediment continues to cycle through the food chain in amounts that regulators consider worth flagging, even if they consider those amounts to be below acute health risk thresholds. The lake has not been declared clean. The area around Port Radium has not been declared safe for unrestricted use. It has been declared managed. These are different things, and the difference matters enormously to the people who live there and who have been asking for clarity for 50 years. In August of 1998, representatives of the Government of Canada traveled to Deliné and delivered a formal apology to the community. The apology acknowledged that the Diné men who had done the portage work during the Port Radium years had not been given information about the health risks of the work they were performing. It acknowledged that this was wrong. It expressed regret. It said sorry. The apology was described by Canadian officials at the time as an important step toward healing and reconciliation. It received modest media coverage in southern Canada, the kind of coverage that a government apology to a remote northern community tends to receive, which is to say, not very much. A brief news cycle, a few editorial comments, then on to the next thing. The community at Delaunay received the apology. They heard it. And then they said, essentially, with considerable dignity and considerable patience, is that all? Because the apology, while genuine in its expression of regret, was carefully worded in ways that fell short of what the community had actually been asking for across the previous several decades. It did not establish a causal connection between the portage work and the specific health outcomes that had occurred in the community. It expressed regret about the lack of information provided to workers, but it stopped short of accepting legal or financial liability for the health consequences of that lack of information. It did not include a commitment to meaningful health compensation for the families of the men who had worked the portage. It did not resolve the outstanding questions about what the government had known and when. And it did not include any guarantee of ongoing monitoring or support that would address the community's continuing concerns about its health and its environment. An apology without accountability is a statement. It can be meaningful and sincere as a statement, but a statement is not reparation, is not compensation, is not the structural change that would prevent the same thing from happening to the same community or a similar community again. The people of Delaunay understood this distinction, and they pressed it consistently and with great clarity in the years following 1998. The health compensation question remained unresolved for years after the apology. The government's position was that establishing a legal causal connection between the portage work and specific health outcomes was not possible, given the absence of dosimetry records and the small population size, a position that was not legally unreasonable, but that served the government's interest in avoiding financial liability more neatly than it served the community's interest in receiving recognition of what had happened to its members. The absence of dosimetry records was not a neutral fact. The dosimetry records did not exist because the government had not required the company to create them. The government was using the gap in the record that its own policy choices had created as a shield against the consequences of those same policy choices. This is a pattern worth recognizing because it appears in the history of industrial and environmental harm to Indigenous communities across Canada and across the world. The government or the company fails to monitor the exposure. Because exposure was not monitored, there are no records of what exposure occurred. Because there are no records, there is no proof of causation. Because there is no proof of causation, there is no legal liability. The people who were harmed have to prove something that cannot be proved, precisely because the people who caused the harm did not create the evidence that would have allowed it to be proved. And the system treats this as a reasonable outcome. The community has continued to press its case in the years since the 1998 apology. The specific demands have evolved and been refined as new information has emerged and as the broader political context of Indigenous rights in Canada has shifted. But the core of what Delaunay has been asking for remains consistent: a full accounting of what happened, what was known, by whom, and when. Recognition of the harm done to specific individuals and families, compensation that reflects the nature and scale of that harm, and assurance that the environmental management of the lake and the mine site will be conducted with the community's genuine participation and with full transparency about the data being collected and what it shows. Some of these things have been partially addressed. The remediation happened, Ongoing monitoring exists. The federal government has engaged in consultation processes with the community on various issues, but the full accounting, the complete and unflinching documentation of what the government knew and when it knew it, has never been produced. Certain archival materials related to the El Dorado operation and its relationship to the Manhattan Project and the post-war nuclear program remain classified or inaccessible. The specific decision-making record, who authorized what, who was briefed on what health information existed, who chose not to tell the community what the ore was and what handling it could do, is not a matter of complete public record. The gaps in the documentary record are themselves part of the story of how this situation has been managed, and they deserve their own careful examination. Researchers, journalists, and community advocates who have attempted to assemble a complete documentary record of the port radium operation and its health and environmental consequences have encountered consistent obstacles in the form of archival gaps, missing files, and the particular kind of institutional opacity that comes from overlapping classification systems, Crown Corporation confidentiality, and the passage of time. The El Dorado Company, which became a Crown Corporation in 1944, was privatized in 1988, when it was merged into a new entity called Cameco Corporation, which remains one of the world's largest uranium producers. The privatization of a Crown Corporation does not, in theory, erase the documentary record of its operations during the years it was a government entity. In practice, the transition from Crown to private corporation created significant confusion and ambiguity about where records went, who held them, and who had the obligation to produce them in response to public access requests. Access to information. Requests filed with the federal government in search of specific categories of documents related to the port radium operation and the health studies conducted there have produced results that are notable for what they do not contain as much as for what they do. Documents that were referenced in other documents, meeting minutes that noted the existence of reports that have not been located, internal correspondence that cited studies whose final versions cannot be found in the accessible archive. These are the hallmarks of a documentary record that has been, at a minimum, imperfectly preserved, and at a maximum, selectively managed. One specific area of difficulty has been the records of the Atomic Energy Control Board, the federal regulatory body that oversaw nuclear materials in Canada during the post-war period. The AECB was responsible for monitoring the handling of uranium at mine and processing sites, including the monitoring of occupational exposure. If any dosimetry records for the radium portage workers existed anywhere in the Canadian institutional system, they would be in the AECB files. Researchers who have attempted to locate such records have found that the relevant files from the early decades of the AECB's operation are incomplete and in some cases absent from the archive. Whether the records were never created, were destroyed as part of routine records management, or are somewhere in the system but not findable through the available finding aids is not a question that has been definitively answered. The National Research Council files from the wartime period are another area of archival complexity. The NRC was deeply involved in Canadian nuclear research during the Manhattan Project period, and its files from that era are subject to classification that has been progressively lifted over the decades, but that has not been fully resolved. Certain categories of document remain restricted or are accessible only in redacted form. Whether those restrictions cover material that would be specifically relevant to the port. Radium worker exposure question is not fully determinable without seeing the restricted material, which is the nature of the problem. None of this is proof of active document destruction or deliberate concealment of specific information, though it is consistent with those possibilities. What it is proof of is that the documentary foundation for a complete account of what happened at Port Radium and who knew what about it does not exist in publicly accessible form, and that this absence has been a consistent feature of the situation for decades across multiple governments of different political orientations in a way that has consistently served the institutional interest in limiting accountability. The Dane people of Daline have been asking for the full story for 50 years. They have not received it, and the lake, which holds its own record in its sediment and its fish and its chemistry, continues to carry what was put into it, regardless of what the archives do or do not contain. The current status of the Port Radium mine site and the broader Cameron Bay area is officially described as long-term monitored care. This is the regulatory category that applies to remediated sites where contamination has been reduced to acceptable levels, but where some ongoing monitoring is required to verify that the site remains stable and that contaminants are not migrating in unexpected ways. The site is managed by Natural Resources Canada, and there is a monitoring program that collects data on sediment, water quality, and biota in and around the bay. Access to the mine site itself, the actual physical location of the former mine, workings and processing facilities, is restricted. This restriction is standard for remediated industrial sites and reflects the genuine hazards that exist there. Residual radioactive material in capped tailings, unstable mine infrastructure, and the general principle that sites where industrial contamination has been managed but not eliminated should not be open to unrestricted public access. This is not a controversial restriction, and it has a straightforward practical justification. What is more complicated and more worth examining is the broader pattern of access, management, and information control that surrounds not just the mine site, but the data about the lake, the fish, and the ongoing environmental conditions of the eastern arm of Great Bear Lake. The monitoring program that exists generates data. That data is collected, analyzed, and reported. Some of it is publicly available in the form of published reports and regulatory submissions. Some of it is accessible through access to information processes, and some of it exists in the form of raw data, technical appendices, and internal assessments that are not routinely published and that require specific requests to obtain. The practical effect of this structure is that the community most directly affected by the contamination does not have automatic and transparent access to the information about the environment they live near and depend on, in a form they can use and in a time frame that allows for meaningful community decision-making. The Fish Advisory for Cameron Bay is perhaps the clearest example of this dynamic. The advisory exists. It recommends limiting consumption of certain fish species caught in the bay, but the advisory is not prominently communicated. It does not appear on signage at the lake. It is not distributed as a regular reminder to community members. It exists in documents that you have to know to look for in order to find. In a community that relies on fishing as a cultural and nutritional practice, and where subsistence fishing is integrated into daily life in ways that are difficult to separate from larger questions of cultural continuity and food security, an advisory about limiting consumption of certain fish from certain parts of the lake is not a trivial matter, but it is being communicated in ways that minimize friction for the government rather than maximizing protection for the community. The monitoring program itself has faced questions about its independence and completeness. The program is funded and managed by the federal government, and the government both generates and reviews the data it produces. Independent scientific assessment of the monitoring program's scope and methodology has sometimes found gaps, including questions about the adequacy of sampling frequency, the choice of what to measure and what not to measure, and the standards used to determine what constitutes an acceptable level of contamination in the specific ecological context of a subarctic lake used by a subsistence fishing community. These are technical questions, but they have direct practical implications for the community's understanding of its own situation. There is a broader context for understanding the Port Radium story that requires stepping back from the specific details of this particular lake and this particular community and looking at the pattern that this story is part of, because the pattern is real, and recognizing it is essential to understanding what kind of thing happened here and why it keeps happening. The Experimental Lakes area, known as the ELA, is a collection of 58 small lakes in northwestern Ontario that has been used by the federal government for scientific research since 1968. The lakes are identified by number rather than by name. Lake 226, Lake 240, Lake 302. The numerical designation is itself a statement of the relationship between the scientific program and the lakes. They are instruments, not places. They are tools for studying freshwater ecology, which is valuable scientific work, but the way the program treats the lakes as interchangeable numbered units, rather than as specific places with ecological histories and, in many cases, relationships to the Anishinaabe people whose traditional territory surrounds them, reflects a particular orientation toward what these lakes are for. The scientific work done at the ELA is often cited as among the most significant field-scale ecological research in Canadian history. The phosphorus eutrophication experiments of the 1970s, in which Lake 226 was divided by a vinyl curtain, and one half was deliberately fertilized to demonstrate the connection between phosphorus runoff and algae blooms, produced findings that influenced water quality regulation across North America. The acidification experiments of the 1980s, in which several lakes were deliberately acidified to study the effects of acid rain on freshwater ecosystems, provided some of the most compelling scientific evidence for the harm caused by sulfur dioxide emissions from coal-burning power plants. The ELA has been a real and productive scientific facility, but it has also been a facility where the federal government has deliberately added to Canadian lakes, without public consultation or independent ethical review. In the early decades, a range of substances, including mercury, radioactive tracers, DDT metabolites, pharmaceutical, estrogens, and other compounds whose effects on freshwater systems were being studied precisely because they were potentially or actually harmful. The lakes of the ELA are off limits to the public. The data from those lakes is not always publicly accessible in a timely or complete form, and the lakes themselves sit in a region that has both ecological significance and indigenous cultural and territorial meaning that is not always centered in the way the scientific program is conducted. In 2012, the conservative government of Stephen Harper announced that it would close the ELA and eliminate its federal funding, citing budget constraints. The announcement produced a significant public and scientific backlash, and eventually a coalition of provincial governments and a nonprofit organization took over the facility's management. The ELA continues to operate, but the episode illustrated something important. The government had been running a program that involved deliberate manipulation of Canadian freshwater lakes, with restricted public access and incomplete data transparency for over 40 years, and it could announce the end of that program with minimal prior notice and without any comprehensive public accounting of what had been done to those lakes and what the long-term ecological implications might be. CFB Suffield in Alberta is another example of the same general pattern. It is the largest military base in Canada, covering approximately 2,600 square kilometers of prairie grassland in the southeastern corner of the province. Within its borders, there are wetlands, lakes, ponds, and seasonal water bodies that have been part of a restricted military zone since the base was established in the 1940s. During World War II, CFB Suffield was used for testing chemical weapons, including mustard gas, phosgene, and other agents, under a British-Canadian program that deliberately chose a remote prairie location, specifically because the testing could be done away from populated areas and with minimal public knowledge. The soil and water within the base boundary carry a documented legacy of that testing, and the restricted zone that prevents public access to those areas is maintained partly for legitimate safety reasons related to unexploded ordnance and residual chemical contamination. But the base is also a place where the specific nature and extent of contamination, the distribution of chemical agent residues in soil and water, the long-term ecological implications of decades of military testing, are not subjects about which the public has access to comprehensive and transparent information. The monitoring that occurs is conducted by the military, which both generates and reviews the data, and the public accountability mechanisms for that monitoring are limited. Pinecrest Creek, which flows through CFB Petawawa in Ontario, the Canadian Forces' largest base, has similarly been the subject of environmental concerns related to military contamination, including fuels, solvents, and unexploded ordnance that have been managed within the classified and restricted framework of military base operations. The communities adjacent to these bases have had limited ability to access information about what is in the water that flows through and out of the base area. The pattern across these examples is not identical, and it would be wrong to suggest that the government's management of the experimental lakes area is morally equivalent to what happened at Port Radium, because the Port Radium story involves a specific indigenous community, a specific wartime secrecy operation, and a specific set of decisions about worker safety that caused direct and serious harm to identifiable individuals. But the pattern does share certain structural features: federal government control of remote freshwater areas, restricted public access, data managed by the same institution that generated the conditions being monitored, and limited mechanisms for independent verification or community accountability. These structural features are not accidents. They reflect a durable institutional preference for managing information about what governments do to the natural environment in ways that minimize external scrutiny, and when harm has occurred, that minimize legal and financial accountability. Satellites do not respect restricted zones. They move across the entire surface of the Earth at orbital altitudes that no ground-based restriction can affect, and they have been producing imagery of the Great Bear Lake area, including the eastern arm and the Cameron Bay mine site, for decades. The availability of commercial high-resolution satellite imagery has expanded enormously since the mid-2000s, to the point where anyone with internet access can look at detailed imagery of a location that is physically accessible only by aircraft and that is subject to access restrictions on the ground. What the satellite imagery of the Cameron Bay area shows is consistent with what the environmental monitoring reports describe: a mine site that has been substantially cleaned up, but that still shows the physical markers of industrial activity. The areas of disturbed ground, the cleared terrain where the mine infrastructure stood, the spoil areas, are visible. The color differentiation in the soil and rock in certain areas, which can reflect both natural geological variation and the mineral residues of industrial processing, is visible. The proximity of the mine site to the water body, the tight relationship between the disturbed land and the lakeshore, is evident in a way that makes the pathway by which contamination could move from land to water easy to understand. More interesting than the visible physical markers, however, is what the satellite record shows over time. High-resolution multispectral imagery, the kind that captures light across wavelengths beyond the visible spectrum, can reveal patterns in vegetation and water that are not apparent to the naked eye. Near-infrared reflectance patterns in vegetation can indicate stress, the kind of stress that occurs when plants are dealing with elevated concentrations of heavy metals or radionuclides in the soil. Watercolor in the near-infrared and shortwave infrared bands can indicate the presence of suspended sediment, and in some cases can be used to infer the presence of certain dissolved minerals. These are not definitive diagnostic tools when used from satellite altitude, but they are capable of flagging areas where ground-level investigation would be warranted. Independent analysts who have reviewed multispectral imagery of the Cameron Bay area have noted vegetation stress patterns on the slopes adjacent to the former mine processing area that are consistent with heavy metal contamination. The patterns are not dramatic or obvious, and they are not the kind of thing that would be apparent from a standard visible spectrum image of the kind available on commercial mapping services. But they are present, and they are in the locations where you would expect to find them if the site remediation had reduced but not eliminated the influence of mine-derived contamination on the surrounding land. The water quality data available for Cameron Bay shows elevated levels of uranium in the water column and radium-226 in the sediment at sampling points within the bay. These values have been measured at various points since the environmental assessment program began in the late 1980s. The trend over time shows a general decline, which is consistent with what you would expect following the removal of the most acute contamination sources during the remediation. But decline toward a lower baseline is not the same as decline toward zero, and for radionuclides with half-lives measured in centuries and millennia, zero is not a reachable endpoint on any human timescale. The monitoring data shows improvement. It does not show resolution. The fish consumption advisory that applies to Cameron Bay is a tangible expression of this ongoing condition. Fish do not observe administrative boundaries. A lake trout does not know where the remediated zone ends and the unaffected zone begins. Fish that feed along the bottom of Cameron Bay, where radium-226 concentrations in the sediment remain elevated, accumulate those radionuclides in their tissues over the course of their lives. A fish that lives for 20 years in Cameron Bay will have a different tissue burden of radionuclides than a fish that lived the same 20 years in the unaffected western arm of the lake. The consumption advisory acknowledges this reality, but the advisory is not preventing consumption. It is advising limits, and it is doing so in ways that are not optimally designed to reach a subsistence fishing community that may not have routine access to government regulatory updates. The community of Delaunay has been living with this ambiguity for generations. They have been living with the knowledge that something happened at the eastern end of their lake that hurt their people. They have been living with incomplete information about the nature and extent of the ongoing environmental condition. They have been living with institutional processes that move slowly, that communicate poorly, and that have historically been oriented more toward managing the government's liability exposure than toward genuinely serving the community's interests. And they have been doing all of this in a place that is physically isolated, economically marginal within the Canadian system, and that the broader Canadian public knows almost nothing about. What the government of Canada has consistently declined to do, across multiple governments of different political orientations spanning more than 6 decades, is provide the community with a complete, unredacted, independently verified account of what happened at Port Radium. Not an account that is shaped by what the government is willing to acknowledge, not an account that is hedged by the government's legal interests, a complete account, what was known, when it was known, who made which decisions, what the alternatives were, why those alternatives were not chosen, what the full extent of the environmental legacy is, and what the ongoing implications for the community's health and food security actually are, stated in plain language and presented with sufficient transparency that the community can form its own informed view of its own situation. That complete account does not exist in public form. It may not exist in any form, and the absence of it is not a neutral fact. It is the result of decades of institutional choices about what to document, what to classify, what to share, and what to let disappear into the administrative machinery of a government that has found it more convenient to apologize in general terms than to account for itself in specific ones. There is a question that sits at the center of this entire story, and that becomes more, not less important the more carefully you look at the details. The question is simply this: why is the eastern arm of Great Bear Lake still not fully open and not fully transparent? The mine has been closed for over 60 years. The remediation is described as complete. The most acute sources of contamination have been removed. The government has issued an apology and expressed regret for what happened. The Cold War is over, and the nuclear secrecy framework that justified withholding information from the public during the 1940s and 1950s has long since been dissolved, at least in theory. Given all of that, why does the restricted zone around the mine site continue? Why is the environmental monitoring data not fully and transparently publicly accessible? Why does the fish consumption advisory continue without a more proactive communication strategy? Why are the archival gaps in the documentary record not addressed by a systematic effort to locate and publish whatever can be found? The answers that the government tends to offer are procedural and administrative. Restricted zones at remediated industrial sites are standard. Monitoring programs have their own reporting timelines and formats. Archival access is managed through existing processes. These answers are accurate as far as they go, but they do not answer the underlying question, which is not why these specific administrative procedures exist, but why the sum of those procedures produces a situation in which a community that was harmed by government decisions 60 years ago still does not have full and transparent access to the information about its own situation. The government's management of the Port Radium legacy is not a story of malicious, ongoing conspiracy. It is a story of institutional inertia, of bureaucratic structures that were built to protect the government's interests and that continue to function that way long after the original crisis has passed, of accountability frameworks that were inadequate to the situation they were supposed to manage and that have never been fundamentally reformed, and of a community whose political marginality within the Canadian system has made it consistently easier to offer partial remedies than complete ones. But the effect of that institutional inertia on the people who live at Delaunay is indistinguishable from their perspective from the effect of deliberate ongoing concealment. They cannot access the full story of what happened to them. They do not have transparent access to current data about the lake and its fish. Their questions have been met consistently with processes that move slowly and produce qualified results. And the lake itself, their lake, the lake that the Satuotan have lived alongside for thousands of years, is still carrying a burden that the government put into it and then managed its way around, rather than accounting for honestly. The Dean people of Delaunay did not ask to be at the center of this story. They did not invite the mine. They did not ask to have their traditional ecological knowledge ignored by people who then turned around and hired them to carry radiological hazards on their backs. They did not ask for the cancer that came in the years after the mine closed. They did not ask for decades of institutional evasion dressed up as concern. They asked for the truth consistently for 50 years, and they have received approximately half of it, maybe less. What they knew before any of this happened, what their elders encoded into the cultural memory of the community across 1,000 years of careful observation, was that the Eastern Shore gave poison. They were right. The people who came from outside and told them they were wrong, that the modern science of mining and extraction superseded whatever the elders knew, were wrong. And the world has never quite fully reckoned with what that means about who should have been listened to, and when, and why the people who were right were not. To understand what Delaunay has actually asked for and what it has and has not received, it is worth going through the specific demands that the community leadership has articulated across the past several decades, because the specificity of those demands is itself evidence of how clearly and carefully the community has understood its own situation. The community has asked for a complete public release of all government documents related to the Port Radium mine operation, including documents related to the health monitoring of workers, documents related to the government's internal knowledge of radiological hazards at the site, and documents related to the decision-making process that resulted in Indigenous workers being employed on the portage without protection or information. This request has not been fully met. The community has asked for an independent epidemiological study commissioned and overseen by a body with no institutional interest in the outcome that would examine cancer rates and other health outcomes in Delaunay across the full period of the mine's operation and in the decades following its closure, and that would compare those rates to appropriate control populations with full statistical transparency. A government-commissioned health study was conducted, but it was not fully independent. Its methodology was questioned by some researchers, and its conclusions, while finding elevated rates of certain cancers, were framed in ways that stopped short of establishing the causal connection that the community was seeking. The community has asked for financial compensation for the families of men who worked the portage and who subsequently died of cancers that are consistent with occupational radiological exposure. Some limited financial assistance has been provided over the years, but it has not been structured as compensation in the legal or moral sense of the word. It has been structured as humanitarian assistance, which is a categorization that explicitly does not carry the acknowledgement of responsibility that the community has been asking for. The community has asked for a guaranteed seat at the table in all decisions about the ongoing monitoring and management of the mine site and the affected area of the lake, with genuine decision-making authority rather than mere consultation. Consultation without decision-making authority is a process that gives a community the experience of participation without its substance, and it is the standard mode in which the Canadian government manages its relationships with Indigenous communities on resource and environmental management issues in ways that have been consistently criticized as inadequate under both Canadian constitutional law and international standards for Indigenous rights. The community has asked for the fish consumption advisory to be communicated clearly, proactively, and in a form that is accessible to community members who may not routinely access government regulatory documents. This remains an area of inadequacy, and the community has asked, most fundamentally, for the kind of honest reckoning with history that would allow for genuine healing, which requires not just an expression of regret, but an accounting, a clear-eyed, complete, public accounting of what happened, why it happened, and what the institutional choices were that allowed it to happen. Without that accounting, the community is left in the position of knowing that something was done to it, but not being able to access the full record of how and by whom, which is a form of ongoing injustice regardless of whether it is accompanied by an apology. The international human rights framework that has developed over the past several decades has increasingly recognized the rights of indigenous peoples in situations like this one. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007 and eventually endorsed by Canada in 2016, establishes rights to free, prior, and informed consent for activities that affect indigenous lands and resources, rights to environmental information, and rights to redress for historical harms. The Port Radium situation predates most of this framework, but the framework now exists, and Canada's obligations under it are relevant to how the ongoing legacy of Port Radium is managed. Canada's endorsement of UNDRIP has not resulted in a comprehensive review and remediation of the Port Radium legacy in the terms that the community has been asking for. The endorsement occurred, and government policy on Indigenous resource and environmental rights has shifted in some ways over the years since, but the specific accountability gap around Port Radium has not been closed. It has been acknowledged in general terms and addressed in limited ways, but it has not been resolved. The story of Port Radium and Great Bear Lake exists within a larger history of the Canadian state's relationship to the land, to the people who have lived on that land since long before the state existed, and to the extraction of natural resources from remote areas where the affected populations have had limited political power. That larger history is not a secret. It is the subject of a very large and growing body of scholarly, journalistic, and community-generated documentation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which operated from 2008 to 2015 and documented the history and ongoing legacy of the residential school system, represented a significant national reckoning with one major element of that history. But the residential schools were only one element, and the reckoning was partial. The uranium story is another element, and it has received far less attention than the residential school story, despite being in some ways equally illustrative of the core dynamics of colonialism as it was practiced in Canada. The extraction of value from Indigenous lands, the displacement or exploitation of Indigenous people in the service of that extraction, the withholding of information and agency from the communities most affected, and the institutional management of the resulting harms in ways that prioritize the state's interests over those of the people who were harmed. There are people alive today in Delaunay who were children when the mine was operating, who watched the ore boats move through the lake, who grew up in a community where men were doing portage work they were not told the nature of, who were alive when their fathers and uncles and community members started getting sick, and who watched their families ask questions that did not receive honest answers for decades. Those people are in their 70s and 80s now. They are the living connection between what happened and the present. When they are gone, the living memory of the experience will belong only to the generation that follows, the children and grandchildren of the people who were directly affected, who have inherited both the history and the ongoing absence of its full accounting. What those people have carried and what the community of Delaunay has carried collectively for generations is something that cannot be quantified in epidemiological studies or remediation reports or government apologies. It is the particular weight of knowing that you were done wrong, knowing it clearly and with certainty, and watching the institutional machinery that did you wrong continue to function in ways that tell you, through every slow process and every qualified answer and every administrative delay, that the full truth is not something you are owed. The lake does not have an opinion about any of this. The lake is 31,000 square kilometers of cold, northern water, and it has been there for 10,000 years since the last glaciation carved out the basin and filled it. and it will be there for a very long time after every person who has ever had a stake in this story is gone. What the lake does have is memory of a kind, the kind that is stored in sediment rather than in stories. The radium-226 in the floor of Cameron Bay has a half-life of 1,600 years. It will still be measurable there in the year 3600. The contamination that the mine put into the lake will outlast the government that authorized the mine, the government that nationalized it, the government that oversaw the remediation, and every government that comes after. The lake will carry what was done to it long after the institutional actors responsible have dissolved into history. The Dane people of Déliney will likely still be there. Their connection to Great Bear Lake is not contingent on a government program or a corporate operation or a strategic resource assessment. It is ancestral and it is deep, and it has proven across the decades of this story to be more durable than the various institutional arrangements that have come in from the outside and shaped the community's circumstances without its consent. What the community continues to ask for is not complicated. It is the most basic thing that a government owes to people it has harmed: honesty, a complete, transparent, unqualified account of what happened, an acknowledgement without the careful hedging of legal liability, compensation that reflects the nature of the harm, genuine partnership in the ongoing management of the environment they live in, and a commitment that the structural conditions that made this situation possible, the combination of resource pressure, geographic isolation, political marginality, and institutional opacity, will not be allowed to produce the same outcome for another community in another remote place in the future. There is a dimension of this story that rarely gets discussed in the usual accounts of the Port Radium history, and it has to do with how the global nuclear economy was structured in the post-war period, and how that structure determined and continues to determine which communities bear the costs of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and which communities benefit from them. The nuclear economy runs on uranium. Every nuclear power plant, every nuclear weapon requires uranium as its fundamental input material. And uranium, like most mineral resources, is not evenly distributed across the surface of the Earth. It concentrates in specific geological formations in specific places, and in many of those places, the people who have lived on the land for generations have been the people least able to resist the extraction pressure that follows when those formations are identified. The Athabasca Basin of northern Saskatchewan is the site of the richest uranium deposits ever identified on Earth, producing ore with uranium concentrations that far exceed anything found elsewhere in the world. The communities affected by Athabasca Basin uranium mining are predominantly Dean and Cree, indigenous communities whose relationship to the land in that region predates the Canadian state by thousands of years. The uranium from those deposits has fueled power plants in Ontario, Quebec, and the United States, and has been exported to fuel nuclear programs in Europe and Asia. The benefits of that electricity, measured in kilowatt hours, and avoided carbon emissions and economic output, accrue largely to urban populations far from northern Saskatchewan. The costs, measured in disrupted landscapes, contaminated water bodies, health concerns, and the particular burden of living on and around an industrial operation of enormous scale and potential consequence, are borne by the communities adjacent to the mines. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a mystery. It is the predictable outcome of a political economic system in which the communities with the least political power and the least ability to resist extraction end up bearing the risks of extraction, while the communities with the most political power and the most access to the benefits of that extraction pay their electricity bills without ever having to think about where the fuel came from. The uranium supply chain, which runs from mines in remote northern communities, through processing facilities, through enrichment plants, through reactor fuel fabrication to power plants in populated areas, is largely invisible to the people at the end of it, and that invisibility is structural. What happened at Port Radium was an extreme version of this dynamic, made worse by the wartime secrecy requirements of the Manhattan Project and by the particular violence of the colonial relationships in the Northwest Territories in the 1930s and 1940s. But it was not anomalous. It was a specific instance of a general pattern that has characterized the uranium industry from its beginning. The Navajo Nation in the American Southwest experienced something strikingly similar in the post-war period. Navajo men were hired to mine uranium on Navajo land for American nuclear weapons programs, without adequate protection and without information about the risk of the work. The resulting health effects, lung cancer, and other radiation-related illness were documented decades later. The federal government eventually passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in 1990, providing payments to Navajo uranium miners and their survivors, though the compensation has been widely criticized as inadequate and the process of obtaining it as unnecessarily burdensome for an elderly and often geographically remote population. The Canadian parallel is obvious, and the Canadian resolution, such as it is, has followed a similar trajectory of belated partial acknowledgement and limited compensation. The Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests between 1946 and 1958, represents an even more extreme case. The Marshallese people were displaced from their home islands for testing operations, exposed to radiological fallout from multiple tests, and told for years that the contamination affecting their islands was not severe enough to warrant concern. The health effects, both from direct radiation exposure and from the consumption of contaminated food and water, have been documented and are severe. The Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal awarded over $2 billion in damages in 2000, but the United States has never fully honored that award. The islands of Bikini and Rongelap remain uninhabitable. The Marshallese people have been living with the legacy of what was done to their land and their bodies for over 70 years, asking for accountability that has not fully arrived. These cases, the den at Deline, the Navajo uranium miners, the Marshallese people, are not the same case. The specific histories are different. The specific harms are different. The specific relationships to different governments are different, but they share a structure that is not coincidental. The nuclear economy extracted its raw materials and conducted its most dangerous activities in places where the affected populations had the least power to resist, the least access to legal redress, and the least ability to demand and receive accountability. And in each case, the process of recognition and remedy has been slow, partial, and shaped at every stage by the government's interest in limiting the scope of its acknowledged responsibility. The question of what Canada should do now, in the second decade of the 21st century, about the Port Radium legacy is not purely academic. The community of Deline still exists. Its members are still living alongside the affected lake. The environmental monitoring is still ongoing. The archival gaps are still there. The fish consumption advisory is still in effect, and the community is still asking, with the patience that comes from having been asking for a very long time, for a complete and honest accounting. What a complete accounting would require is not primarily a technical or scientific exercise, though it has technical and scientific elements. It would require a genuine political will to prioritize the interests of a small, remote, indigenous community over the institutional interests of the government, agencies, and crown corporations that were responsible for what happened, and to do so in a complete rather than a partial way. It would require a willingness to accept that the acknowledgement of full responsibility has financial and legal implications, and to accept those implications rather than managing the process to minimize them. It would require treating the specific knowledge and the specific experience of the community not as information to be incorporated into a government-led process, but as a fundamental basis for the entire exercise. None of these things are beyond the capacity of the Canadian government. They are within reach. They would cost money, and they would require an acknowledgement of institutional failure that carries political discomfort. But the gap between what the government has done and what the community has asked for is not a gap defined by impossibility. It is a gap defined by priority. The community of Des-Lyneux has been a priority of the Canadian government precisely when, and only when, what the government needed from the community or its location outweighed the inconvenience of addressing its concerns. During the war years, the ore was the priority and the community was available labor. After the war, the ongoing nuclear program made the continued operation of the mine the priority, and the community's questions about health could be deferred. When the political cost of indefinitely deferring the health question became too high, an apology was offered that was shaped by the priority of limiting legal liability. And through all of it, the community itself, its needs and its knowledge, and its right to full information about its own situation, has consistently been a secondary consideration. The lake does not care about any of this, but the people who live on its shores do, and they have been caring and asking and waiting for a very long time. Great Bear Lake will freeze again this winter, as it has every winter for 10,000 years. The ice will grow thick and quiet, and the great booming groan of its expansion will carry across the surface of the water in the still northern air. The fish will move under the ice in the dark water. The lake trout and the whitefish and the cisco navigating a lake floor whose sediment carries what was put into it more than 80 years ago and will carry it for centuries more. The community of Des-Lyneux will live through another winter on the western shore, fishing and hunting and maintaining the cultural practices and the communal bonds that have held the Saat-Duotan together, through everything that history has brought to this place. And in the archived files of the federal government, in the records of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited and Natural Resources Canada and the Privy Council Office, there are documents that describe decisions made about this lake and the people around it. Some of those documents are accessible, some are classified, some are missing, and some of them, perhaps, have answers to questions the community has been asking since before most Canadians who are alive today were born. The lake is not going anywhere. The community is not going anywhere. The questions are not going anywhere. What Canada chooses to do about that is not a mystery, it is a choice. And the choice being made, year after year, is visible in what continues to be withheld, what continues to be qualified, and what continues to be managed rather than resolved. A lake off limits is not always just an environmental protection zone. Sometimes it is a boundary around an accountability that has not yet been fully met, and the boundary around Cameron Bay, on the eastern shore of the largest lake in Canada, in a place that the Dean people called the place of the poison rock long before any outsider arrived to mine it, is that kind of boundary. The restriction is still there. The question of what it is protecting and for whose benefit has never been more clearly in need of a direct and honest answer. There are some things that resist the kind of documentation that would make them fully knowable. The experience of carrying a bag of uranium ore on your back across a portage in the Northwest Territories in 1942 cannot be reconstructed from archival records, even if all the records existed and all of them were accessible. The experience of watching your father get sick and die and not knowing why, of asking questions and receiving qualified non-answers for decades, of living adjacent to a lake that your ancestors warned you about and that the outside world confirmed was dangerous only after the damage was done. That experience lives in people, not in documents. And when the people who carry it are gone, something irreplaceable goes with them. The community of Delinay has been engaged in a long-term project of documenting its own history in its own terms, in ways that center the community's knowledge and the community's experience, rather than the government's version of events. Community-controlled research, oral history projects, the work of connecting younger community members to the knowledge that the elders carry. These are forms of accountability that do not wait for government authorization and that do not depend on government cooperation. They are forms of sovereignty, the sovereignty of a community over its own story. The Sa Tuat'un Water Monitoring Program, an initiative in which community members participate in the collection of environmental data about the lake using methods that integrate traditional ecological knowledge with scientific monitoring approaches, represents this kind of community-led accountability. The program operates with the understanding that the people who have lived on and with the lake for thousands of years are not simply passive recipients of environmental monitoring data produced by outside experts. They are knowledge holders, observers, and participants whose engagement with the lake produces information that the scientific monitoring program, operating as it does from the outside and on government timelines, cannot fully replicate. Whether the data produced by community-led monitoring will be integrated into the regulatory framework that governs the ongoing management of the mine site and the affected area of the lake is an open question. The history of indigenous environmental monitoring programs being genuinely integrated into government decision-making rather than noted and then set aside is not entirely encouraging. But the existence of the program is itself significant. It represents the community refusing to be solely dependent on the government for knowledge about its own situation. The broader question of what happens to the uranium industry in Canada as the nuclear energy debate evolves is relevant to understanding the context in which the Port Radium legacy exists. Nuclear energy has been undergoing a reappraisal in the context of the climate crisis as the recognition grows that the decarbonization of electricity systems requires low-carbon baseload generation that intermittent renewables alone cannot currently provide. Canada's uranium industry, centered on the Athabasca Basin deposits in Saskatchewan, is positioned to benefit from any expansion of global nuclear capacity. Small modular reactor technology, which several Canadian provinces are exploring as a complement to renewable energy development, would increase domestic uranium demand. In this context, the question of how Canada manages the historical legacy of uranium extraction and its relationship with the indigenous communities whose lands have been most affected by that extraction is not a closed historical question. It is a live political question about the conditions under which the next phase of uranium development should proceed. The Dene people of Delinay, the communities adjacent to the Athabasca Basin operations, the indigenous communities across northern Canada whose lands sit above geological formations of potential nuclear value, are living in this context. The lessons of Port Radium, if they are genuinely learned and genuinely acted on, should shape how the next phase unfolds. If they are not genuinely learned, the pattern will repeat. There is something that the story of Great Bear Lake asks of everyone who encounters it, and it is not a comfortable thing to be asked. It asks you to consider what you know and do not know about where the things you use come from, the electricity that powers the device on which you are watching this. the industrial products whose manufacturing requires power, the political and economic systems that make your way of life possible, and the supply chains that underlie those systems. Somewhere in those supply chains, in most cases in multiple places, there are communities carrying costs that you are not carrying, bearing risks that you are not bearing, living with consequences that you are not living with, because your position in the political economic system allows you to receive the benefits without having to be aware of the costs. This is not a uniquely Canadian problem. It is not even uniquely a problem of the nuclear industry. It is a structural feature of the way that industrial economies distribute benefits and costs across populations that are differently situated in terms of political power, geographic location, and historical relationship to the state. But understanding that it is a general structural feature does not excuse any specific instance of it. The fact that the Port Radium story is one of many similar stories does not make it less of a story. The fact that there are Navajo uranium miners and Marshallese Islanders and communities adjacent to uranium mills in Niger and the Central African Republic who are living versions of the same basic story does not diminish what happened to the people of Deline. If anything, it intensifies the obligation to understand it clearly and to take it seriously. The Dene people had the knowledge. They encoded it into their cultural memory. They kept the instructions alive across 1,000 years of winters and summers on the shore of a lake that they understood in ways that took the outside world most of a century to confirm was carrying something that required respect and care. They were not believed, and then they were not protected, and then they were not compensated, and then they were not given the full truth. And the lake that carries the memory of all of this in its sediment is still there, still cold, still deep, still alive with fish, still connected to the people who have lived beside it since before the state that now manages it as a resource zone and a monitored contamination site was even imagined. That is not a history that can be contained within a remediation report or resolved by an apology. It is a history that requires ongoing attention, ongoing accountability, and a fundamental shift in how the interests and the knowledge and the rights of the community most affected are weighted against the institutional interests of the government that is responsible for what happened. The lake is not going anywhere. The community is not going anywhere. And the obligation, clearly stated and not yet fully met, is not going anywhere either. If there is one thing worth taking from this story, it is this: knowledge that is dismissed because of who holds it, rather than because of whether it is accurate, is not just a wrong done to the person whose knowledge is being dismissed. It is a wrong done to everyone who might have been protected if that knowledge had been listened to. The Dean elders who encoded the warning about the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake were right. The people who dismissed their knowledge were wrong, and people died because of that wrongness. That is a lesson that applies to every situation in which institutional authority decides that certain kinds of knowing do not count as knowledge. It is a lesson that this particular lake and the particular people who live beside it have been trying to teach the rest of the country for a very long time. The question is whether the country is ready to be taught. The restriction around Cameron Bay on Great Bear Lake was not built in a single moment. It accumulated across time, layer by layer, out of wartime secrecy requirements and corporate confidentiality and regulatory standard setting and environmental management protocols, until the cumulative effect is a zone of limited access and limited information that surrounds one of the most consequential episodes in the environmental and human rights history of the Canadian North. Understanding how that accumulation happened is important because it is not unique to Great Bear Lake. There are other places in Canada where the same accumulation of legitimate seeming reasons for restricted access and limited data transparency has produced a situation in which a community's ability to understand and participate in decisions about its own environment is substantially constrained. Some of those places are in the north, some of them are in the south, some of them involve indigenous communities, and some of them do not. But the structural pattern, the way that institutional opacity builds over time through a series of individually defensible decisions that collectively produce a result that is not defensible, is recognizable once you have seen it clearly in one place. The story of what happened to the people of Delaunay is not a story about a single bad decision by a single bad actor. It is a story about a system that assigned differential value to different kinds of lives and different kinds of knowledge. A system that prioritized extraction and strategic advantage over the health and informed consent of the people in the extraction zone. A system that, when the consequences of those priorities became visible, managed those consequences in ways that protected the system's institutional interests rather than the interest of the people who had been harmed. And a system that continues, through inertia and through the accumulated weight of decades of partial rather than complete accountability, to produce a situation that the affected community still does not find adequate. Naming the system does not solve the problem, but it does make it harder to mischaracterize the problem as a series of individual unfortunate events, as mistakes made in good faith by people who could not have known better, as the product of a different era with different standards. Some of what happened at Port Radium was a product of different standards, in the sense that occupational health protection was less developed and less enforced in the 1930s and 1940s than it is today. But the decision not to tell the workers what they were carrying was not a product of ignorance. The people who made that decision knew what was in the ore. The people who did not tell the workers about it knew that the workers did not know. The silence was chosen, not accidental, and the 50-year pattern of partial accountability that followed was also chosen. Every government that chose to fund a study rather than release documents, to offer humanitarian assistance rather than compensation, to conduct consultation rather than share governance, made a choice. Those choices were not inevitable. They were made by people operating within institutions that gave them options, and the option that was consistently chosen was the one that protected the institution. This is not a comfortable thing to say about the Canadian government, which, in other respects and in other contexts, has done things that deserve genuine respect. Canada has international commitments to human rights, to Indigenous rights, to environmental stewardship that are real and in some areas meaningfully implemented. But those commitments exist in tension with the institutional interests of the same government in specific situations, and when those interests have been in tension with the specific interests of the community at Delaunay, the institutional interests have consistently won, or at least finished first. What would change this is not a revelation of some hidden secret. The facts of what happened at Port Radium are not genuinely secret. They have been documented by researchers and journalists and community advocates. The broad outlines are known. What would change this is political will, which means what would change this is public attention, which means what would change this is people knowing about it and deciding that they care. That is not a particularly hopeful framing, because public attention is a scarce resource, and it is competed for intensely, and it rarely lands on issues affecting remote Indigenous communities with the force and duration that would be required to produce structural change. But it is the honest framing. The accountability gap around the Port Radium legacy will close, to the extent that it closes at all, because enough people who are not the community of Delaunay decide that this matters, and that they are willing to use whatever political access they have to make clear that they expect their government to do better. The lake itself, if you have never seen a subarctic lake in the full depth of winter, is something that requires a specific kind of imagination to hold in your mind. The water is dark under the ice, and the ice is thick and white and silent, except for the booming that it makes as it shifts and expands in the cold. The stars at night above the ice field at the 66th parallel are extraordinary, dense, and clear in a way that is only possible at that latitude in that climate. The wind comes across the open lake from the north and east, and it is the kind of cold that is itself a physical force. There are places on Earth that produce a specific and overwhelming sense of scale, where the human figure is revealed as the small thing it is against the backdrop of something ancient and enormous, and the shore of Great Bear Lake in winter is one of those places. The people who have lived beside this particular scale and this particular ancient, enormous thing have not just survived there. They have thrived for thousands of years by understanding it, by learning from it across generations, by encoding what they learned into stories and practices and instructions that persisted through winters far harder than any of the ones that the people who came to mine the eastern shore had ever experienced. They were not primitive. They were not superstitious. They were precisely calibrated to the place they lived in ways that took the outside world a very long time to appreciate, and that it still does not fully appreciate. The lake is the 8th largest in the world. The community on its western shore is 500 people. The government that has authority over both is headquartered 2,000 kilometers away in a city where the lake is an abstraction, a line on a map, a management challenge, a source of uranium, a place where something unfortunate happened a long time ago that has since been addressed in the appropriate administrative channels. The distance between those two ways of understanding the same place is the distance that this story has been trying to cross for 50 years. Whether it gets crossed is a question about the kind of country Canada chooses to be, not just in the abstract terms of international commitments and constitutional obligations, but in the specific and practical terms of what it does about this particular community and this particular lake and this particular long-standing and not yet fully resolved failure of accountability. The answer to that question is still being written. The community at Deligny is still writing their part of it. The government of Canada is still writing its part. And the lake is patient in the way that only something 10,000 years old can be patient, and it is holding in its sediment and its water and its fish, the physical record of what happened there, waiting for the human part of the story to catch up to the truth that the geology already knows. Before this video ends, I want to go back to something I said near the beginning about the warning that the Dean elders encoded into their cultural memory across 1,000 years of winters on the shore of Great Bear Lake. The warning about the eastern shore, the instruction not to camp there, not to drink from there, not to eat the fish from that part of the lake in large quantities. The phrase that has been translated as the place of the poison rock. I keep returning to that warning because of what it represents about the relationship between a community and a place, and about what it means to know something in a way that survives the generations, that outlasts the individuals who first observed the thing being known, that carries forward through time in a form that people can use and act on, even when the original observations that produced the knowledge are too far in the past to be personally remembered. That kind of knowledge is rare, and it is hard-won, and it is fragile. It requires a community that is stable enough, connected enough, and committed enough to the transmission of what it has learned to keep the knowledge alive, even when there is no immediate practical crisis that would make the knowledge obviously relevant. The DN people kept that warning alive for centuries, when no one from outside was mining the eastern shore, and when the warning might have seemed, in any given generation, like a piece of ancestral caution about a place that most people avoided anyway. They kept it alive because they understood, in a way that institutional memory rarely achieves, that the danger might not always be in the past. They were right. The danger was not in the past. It came forward through time in the form of a mine and a war and a supply chain and a geopolitical strategy. And when it arrived, the warning was still there, in the oral tradition of the community, correctly identifying the nature of the hazard and correctly advising caution. And it was ignored. And people paid for that with their lives and their health and their certainty about what the lake that had always fed them was now carrying in its water and its fish. What would it mean to take that kind of knowledge seriously? Not as a curiosity, not as a romantic notion about indigenous ecological wisdom, but as genuine data generated through a process that is methodologically different from but not inferior to the data generation methods of Western science, and worthy of the same kind of careful attention and institutional response that peer-reviewed research receives. It would mean that when a community says we have noticed that something in this specific place is making people sick, that statement is treated as a research hypothesis worth serious investigation, rather than as an anecdote to be noted and filed. It would mean that the absence of dosimetry records does not automatically defeat the claim that exposure occurred, because the community's own account of the conditions of exposure is taken as evidence rather than dismissed as testimony. It would mean that the fish consumption advisory is communicated proactively to the community affected by it, in a form and in a language, and through channels that actually reach the people for whom it is relevant. It would mean that the environmental monitoring data about the lake is shared with the community in real time, not processed through layers of institutional review before being released in a form that requires specialized expertise to interpret. None of this is technically difficult. All of it represents a choice about whose knowledge matters and whose interests are being served. If you have watched this far, you have spent time with a story that most people who live in the southern cities of Canada, where the political decisions about the North are made, will never encounter in any form that requires them to sit with it for very long. You've encountered the names of specific people, dean elders, portage workers, community advocates, who have been asking for something reasonable and direct for longer than most of those political decision makers have been alive. You have encountered a lake that is still beautiful, still cold, still productive, still central to the life of the community on its shore, and that is also still carrying, in its sediment and its fish, the physical legacy of decisions made 80 years ago that have not been fully accounted for. I do not know whether this video will change anything about any of that. Videos about remote places and old injustices have limits. But stories matter, and the story of Great Bear Lake and the people of Delaunay and the poison rock that the Dene always knew about is a story that deserves to be known beyond the community that has been living it. So, know it. Think about it. If you are Canadian, consider what it means that this is part of your country's history, and what you think your country owes to the people who carried the ore that helped end a world war and who were not told what they were carrying. If you are not Canadian, consider whether the dynamics described here, the extraction of value from remote Indigenous lands, the withholding of information, the slow and partial accountability that follows, are dynamics that appear in your own country's relationship with its own remote places and its own marginalized communities. And if there is a comment you want to leave, leave it. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what part of this story landed hardest. Tell me if there is something I got wrong or something I missed, or something you think should have been said differently. This kind of content is only worth making if it reaches people who engage with it seriously, and the engagement in the comments is what tells me it is doing that. Subscribe if you have not already. There are more stories like this one from more places, about more lakes and more communities and more institutional decisions that deserve more public attention than they have received. The North is full of them. So is the South. So is every country with remote places and powerful institutions and communities whose political marginality has historically meant that what happens to them and on their land does not generate the kind of scrutiny that it should. Great Bear Lake is the 8th largest lake on Earth. It is cold and deep and ancient and alive. The people on its shore have been there for thousands of years and have known things about it that took the rest of the world most of a century to confirm. The eastern bay is still restricted. The sediment still carries what was put into it. The community is still asking. The lake is still there.